Good afternoon, right? It's afternoon already. Good Erev Shabbos. I received a comment on one of my recent videos from our friend X Morningstar X. And his comments are always very useful because they open up our eyes to a lot of issues. And so I appreciate his reaching out to us today. The gist of the question essentially is, I mentioned something in one of my videos about how, for example, there are different opinions in the Jewish community about cheese and things like that. The vast majority of Orthodox rabbis would say that cheese does need kosher supervision, but we have this anomaly of a very prominent modern Orthodox rabbi who came from a prominent Lithuanian rabbinical ultra-Orthodox background. It's from a very famous dynasty from Lithuania, that he himself allowed craft cheese, and said that there was no reason to believe that craft cheese was not kosher. He said if you don't like to eat it, he would actually go out of his way to offer it to people who visit him in his home, even if he said if you don't like it, that's one thing, but it's good, or something like that. Which the vast majority, even his own students, I would say, would not eat that. Maybe they would eat Miller cheese that has the OU on it, and that maybe ultra Orthodox wouldn't eat. Things like this is a question, but they wouldn't eat craft cheese. But this rabbi, very, very prominent, famous rabbi, a brilliant genius, great scholar, he allowed it. And that's really, part of, essentially something that throughout Judaism we have. I actually said, people were upset at me, I said in the synagogue once that disagreement is sacred in Judaism. That we specifically welcome dispute. There's a relatively little known story, and it is a question because you mentioned these religious wars these religious disagreements have led to war, to violence, and unfortunately sometimes they do, and that's definitely against any violent expressions that were not specifically mandated in Torah, and even most of the violent expressions specifically mandated in Torah, as far as the rabbinical understanding goes, are absolutely anathema, for sure, to rabbinical Judaism. The vast majority of violence is forbidden. But probably the only exception is in self-defense, and that's a reaction to a forbidden type of violence. Other than that, violence is totally forbidden. That doesn't mean there never was violence. Unfortunately, history shows us there was violence. But that's, first of all, that's the exception to the rule. That's not the norm in the Jewish tradition. Anytime it happened, it was a great scandal. And the rabbis at the time who had authority that we don't have today went out of their way to put a stop to it. But that being said, so where do we draw the line? Because, like I said, dispute is sacrosanct, it's sacred, it's holy in Judaism. So how do you make a balance? So there is a passage, the classic example is is a passage in the Talmud, a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. So those who are not familiar, I had another comment about the Talmud recently, and this person said he said jokingly some, anti-Jewish, I don't like that term, anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish statements, and then he said, I'm just joking, I love you all, but I hate the Talmud, this guy said. God forbid to say such a thing. I'm not saying that. Hope no one just takes that little piece of me quoting this other guy out of context, God forbid, because I love the Talmud. I study it every day. And I've went through the entire Babylonian Talmud once. I study the Jerusalem Talmud pretty regularly. Not that much of it, but a little bit here and there. And I finished the Mishnah, which is the basic part of the Talmud, the older part of the Talmud. The way the Talmud is set up is you have the Mishnah, which is the earlier part, the first part that was written down, and then the commentary is called the Gemara. So the Mishnah with the Gemara together are known as the Talmud. Generally, the most popular Talmud, the bigger Talmud, the more authoritative Talmud is the Babylonian Talmud. There's also the Jerusalem Talmud, which is rather obscure, although thankfully ArtScroll now is coming out with the Jerusalem Talmud, which is opening up an aspect of Jewish scholarship that was generally closed, to only really the greatest scholars, and now anyone really has access to it, which is really quite incredible. And there's a lot of wonderful things in the Jerusalem Talmud. There's nothing wrong with the Jerusalem Talmud. It's just that because the Babylonian Talmud is later, it's more authoritative. And also, people should know the Jerusalem Talmud wasn't written in Jerusalem; it was written in the Galilee. But put that aside. Now, if you've ever studied the Talmud, both the Mishnah and the Gemara, it's all arguments. Probably, I would say the most famous and popular tractate, the Talmud is divided into 63 tractates, about half, a little bit more than half of which are covered in the Babylonian Talmud. There are certain ones that are covered only in the Jerusalem Talmud, not the Babylonian Talmud. Certain are only in the Babylonian Talmud, not in the Jerusalem Talmud. Certain that are in both, and certain that are in neither. One that only exists in the Mishnah, although there is Avos Rabbi Nassan, which is kind of similar to what we could consider like the Gemara to Pirkei Avos, but that's not as well known and not as much studied. And it's later, and nobody really knows, who this Rabbi Nassan was anyway. But the different theories, of course. But probably the most popular book of the Talmud, tractate of the Talmud, is Pirkei Avos, or Tractate Avos, the chapters of the Fathers, usually known in English as the Ethics of the Fathers. And these are really in the Mishnah. There are 5 chapters, but there's a 6th chapter that was somewhat apocryphal, that was added more or less liturgically. And it's actually, there are parts of the Talmud that are used liturgically, and this is, probably the most popular and well-known book of the Talmud, and it's been, well-known even outside of Jewish circles. There are certain quotes, for example, that we find in Shakespeare, that seem that he must have had some at some point he saw the Pirkei Avos, this chapter, these 5 or 6 chapters of the Mishnah, and they're printed in most Jewish prayer books to be read more or less liturgically, or to be studied on the Sabbath afternoons in the summer when you have a lot of time in the afternoon. This is what's suggested. It's somewhat liturgically to be studied. And there's a passage there, there's a Mishnah there, excuse me, that says, Kol machlekas she'ein l'shem shamayim soif l'skayim, Kol machlekas she'ein l'shem shamayim ein soif l'skayim. Actually, I was on a forum that's on YouTube from Open Hillel on this very subject a number of years ago, so you can, I don't get any views from that. It's not on my channel, but you can find that on their channel. A rather intense interdenominational discussion of this issue. And some surprising aspects of it as well. But anyway, what I was saying is, so it says any argument that's for the sake of heaven, that's a term to me that you have the right intentions. In the end, it will continue. And any argument that's not for the sake of heaven, it will not continue. Ein sof l'skayim. Its end is not to be held in existence. Okay, and then it gives two examples, one from the Bible and one from the Talmud. The example of machlokas l'shem shamayim, the example of strife for the sake of heaven, is machlokas hillel v'shamai. There was two great rabbinical leaders and their two schools that constantly would argue throughout the Talmud, throughout the Mishnah. Generally, they're quoted. Usually, it's their students, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and who argue, meaning their students. There's actually a theory that secular scholars have suggested that perhaps Jesus of Nazareth, if he existed, was actually a disciple of the school of Shammai. In particular, if you look at Matthew 19, or a similar passage in Mark 15, you'll have something that's almost word for word from a Mishnah, except it's citing a different biblical verse than the Mishnah cites. And the conclusion that, according to the account that the Christians have in their Gospels of their Jesus, is that he came to the same conclusion as the house of Shammai, albeit quoting a different scripture. He quoted Genesis, whereas the three opinions quoted in that Mishnah and the end of Gittin were all quoting the same verse in Deuteronomy, which is really the basic verse. It's about divorce. So, and based on other similar things like that, there have been these theories. I think the name of the book was, I don't know, Hyman Maccabee, I think, wrote the book called, I think it's called Jesus the Pharisee, whatever it is. But the point what I'm saying here is that argument is sacred in Judaism. You don't have by virtue of having the diversity of thought, and classically in the Jewish world, Judaism has widely avoided the type of dogmatism that most other faiths have. It's not to say Judaism has no dogmas, although there is, again, dispute as to what those... I think all Jews agree that there are certain dogmas in Judaism. I mean, all Orthodox Jews at least. The question is, classically speaking, which beliefs in Judaism are dogmas and which ones are not. I mean, the term, it's not exactly the proper term, but what we call, in Hebrew, we call Ikarei Emunah. Ikarei Emunah means the basics, the foundations, the fundamentals of our faith. And there are very few. The most I've ever seen are 15 or 16. And that's uncommon. The most common is that there are there are 13, and then another common view is that there are actually 3, but essentially all of those 13 fit into one of those 3 categories. So there's not much of a disagreement between 3 and 13, as much as, you know, how do we think each one, you know, if you want to break it down to 3, as the Sefer Ikrim does, which basically you would say the book of basics, books of fundamentals, book of roots, or the book of dogmas by Rabbi Yosef Albo, would be that God exists, and included in that God exists these one and these non-corporeal things, which are what Maimonides includes in that category. God communicates with man is the second one, and so included in that is that the Torah is the communication that God gave to man, and the other words of the prophets. And the third is that there is some type of reward and punishment system, which includes ideas of the afterlife, although reward and punishment happens here on earth, as well as eschatology. And Maimonides, in his 13 principles, you know, individualizes those, you know, as 13 principles. And in the liturgy, we have them as statements of faith, or credo, you know, each one preceded by Ani Mamin. That, a lot of people think Maimonides wrote the Ani Mamins. It's not clear exactly who wrote that form, but it was those 13 principles that Maimonides taught that have been incorporated into the prayer book, not as official part of the liturgy, but rather as something that someone could say as a private devotion after the prayer service, and that is, you know, our credo in Judaism. That is our our statement of faith, our belief in our basic dogmas of Judaism. And I've seen synagogues that on certain days of the year, for example, Simchas Torah, will actually say those out loud in a somewhat of a communal sense. And also there's a popular hymn, although most Hasidic communities don't recite this hymn because the Arizal did not include it in his hymnal, but it's sung in most non-Hasidic Ashkenazic communities, and in, as far as I know, most Sephardic communities, although what I've seen in the Sephardic tradition is that there are actually 1 or 2 more verses than the Ashkenazic version, which is a poetic statement of those 13 principles. But again, even with that, and those who don't recite it, for example, one Hasidic community I can think of in particular that specifically does not, even after the prayers, privately recite the 13 principles of faith. They still believe in them. They just feel that what they are teaching is that it's already in our heart. We don't need to express it verbally. We already believe it. Whereas, you know, the other communities, you know, encourage both reciting them and studying them and, you know, meditating on them and so forth. And some actually say it's some sort of a segula for parnasa, or whatever. It's like a charm for livelihood, because by demonstrating our faith, God will support us because of our faithfulness. But again, so that's the one example that, going back to what we were saying, the example of Machlokas L'Shem Shemayim is Hillel and Shammai, and obviously others in the future followed that tradition. Other great rabbis of the Talmud like Abaye and Rava and Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish and so forth, whom we have record of their disagreements. Those great rabbis were the best of friends, but it seems that there was perhaps some actual war between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. It's not spoken of that much, and it's not so clear if it's actually historically true. Some of these things may have been added later by people who were seeking to discredit Judaism. I have a feeling that might be one of them, and there's not really a clear historical basis for that story. But what we do record, however, on the positive side, is that Hillel and Shammai, although they disagreed so strongly in their views in various legal issues, for example, laws of marriage, to the point where one could say that the others, if they followed their own opinion, the other side would be illegitimate, would be a mamzer, would be what they call in English bastard child, but it's actually much different and worse than that. Someone who could not marry. That's how traditionally we understand what it says in the Bible in Deuteronomy, not allowed to enter the congregation of the Lord. People, Christians might read that and think it means like a bastard isn't allowed to go to church or something like that. And I heard a story like that a very famous figure in history, he had a son who I think he was adopted, and the child was illegitimate, and the question was, is perhaps or something like that, and could he go to church? And that's not what it means. It's nothing to do with going to synagogue or going to the temple. In the ancient times, when there was the one temple in Jerusalem, it meant specifically entering the congregation, specifically meant marriage into the mainstream community, would be the understanding, and that someone whose birth was caused by incest or adultery, and specifically biblical adultery, not just fornication, which is also a sin, but biblical adultery, which is any man, whether he's married or single, that doesn't matter, but the woman involved is married to a different man. That's what's biblically understood as adultery. And the result of such a union would be in Hebrew called mamzer. A mamzer is how we usually say in Ashkenazic, in Yiddish, and in the English they translate it as bastard, but it doesn't mean like a child born out of wedlock. It means a child who was born due to adultery, who could not marry into the community, and so to certain other groups, for example, who if they would be allowed to convert, but most people who convert, they could marry, and they can marry someone who's born Jewish, except these certain groups, the Ammonites and the Moabites, for all generations, and the Egyptians and the Edomites for 3 generations, but they are allowed to marry converts from other nations. But all that being said, the Mishnah in Yudayim says that that doesn't apply today, because we don't know who's a Moabite, who's an Ammonite, who's an Egyptian, who's an Edomite. It's about their lineage and not about where they're living. And in the book of Kings in the Bible, we read that Sennacherib, we call it Hebrew Sancheriv, he did something that later in history the Soviets did, displacing people in order that they should lose their national heritage and become assimilated into some other culture. And so he moved different nations around, and so that's how the Kusians came to Samaria. And according to our tradition, that's where the Samaritans come from. The Samaritans still exist, albeit a very small group, only a few hundred people. They have their own beliefs as to who they are and where they come from, but we understand it as what it says in the Book of Kings, the Kusians, the Kutim, and but the point is that there are these different opinions and so forth, and certain opinions, we still respect the opinion of Shammai, even though we follow the opinion of Hillel, as opposed to we do not respect the Sadducees and the Baitusians and these other heretical groups, and specifically because it seems that their intention was not pure, is what it seems to say, meaning the understanding of the rabbinical tradition and of how we learn history is that the Sadducees were just looking for an excuse to be less religious. It wasn't that they actually believed that in the Sola Scriptura ideology. And I think to a certain extent that's why, for example, today certain other groups are successful, because they really believe it. Whether they, and I'm talking about other religions, not in the Jewish world. Whereas in the Jewish world, most of these groups that are just seeking excuses not to really be religious, they're disappearing. Whereas the various Orthodox groups that have various views are all growing tremendously. And the media likes to make a big deal about 2 or 3 people here and there who leave, and a lot of those just leave temporarily and then come back. And they'll make a big deal they'll make a whole documentary about some kid, when he's 17 years old and he's struggling through life, and he had bad things happen to him that are against Torah and against all common decency. And because he was victimized, he's confused and he's messed up mentally. And they're going to make a whole big deal about that, instead of, trying to actually help him, and when the fact of the matter is a lot of people are trying to help him and not being dogmatic with him, not being pushy, just being open-minded and there for this kid, But, I'm sure in 2-3 years he's going to be religious again, Anyway, if he recovers from his drug addiction and everything. The other example of the Machlokas Sheinu L'Shem Shemaim that's not going to continue is Korach V'Chol Adaso. That's what the Mishnah says. Korach and all of his followers, all of his congregation. Which is strange, because that's what the Mishnah says. But if we read the Bible, it seems that Korach, in the book of Numbers, was fighting Moses. So why did it say the fight between Korach and Moses? And the answer is, it's not to fight with Moses, because Moses, Moses didn't have the issue. It was Korach had the issue, and his followers weren't really interested in following him. They were all interested in what they could get out of it. You know, and that's what it seems, you know, to be the story here. So back to this question of, well, is this causing wars? Like I said, there are a few. I'll be honest, there are a few examples like that, and even those, they're not so clear. You know, most of the examples of violence I could think of, like Mishnah Yuma talks about people who are, you know, rushing up the ramp to the altar because they want to be the one, you know, doing the divine service. They wanted that honor, and the one stabbed the other guy and knocked him off and killed him, knocked him off the ramp, and so they said, all right, we got to draw lots, we got to do something else, because that was because, you know, especially in the Second Temple time, the priesthood was very, very corrupted. So that's not really a proof from that. But an interesting thing is that, you know, some years ago, I remember I used to speak at the college at VCU. And the professor there, Professor Smith, I'd go to his class and things and speak there. And he said, he's a pretty liberal guy, and he always said, religion is almost never the cause of wars. Usually politics are the cause of wars, and religion is used as an excuse. And when we see that clearly in World War II, where, you know, Hitler sought to use religion as a tool, and not, there was no actual piety there, you know, on any account. Whether it was, you know, it would seem that most of his actual spirituality was more New Age, neo-pagan, you know, like we have these groups today, Odinists and Asatru and Wotanists and these types of groups. That was a lot of, even though there were certain groups like this that Hitler persecuted as well, but he wasn't a traditional Christian, and he preached what he called positive Christianity, which isn't as nice as it sounds. It just basically means, you know, his own, you know, forgetting all the really Christian things about Christianity, turn the other cheek, and the meek shall inherit the earth, and all those things, and God is love, and instead just making it into whatever he wanted religion to be for his political purposes. And there's more to that, but, you know, so it wasn't that he was, you know, religion wasn't the issue there. And so to, you know, any examples you want to give, the Crusades or the Inquisition, it's not really a war, but, and yeah, all these things, they were definitely clothed in religious, you know, fervor, and, oh, maybe there is let's turn around. But it wasn't like, wasn't specifically a religious issue. It was, religion was used as a tool for the secular political gain, as it often is. You know, the same thing as in Israel and other places and so forth. And it's not really about religion. It's really about, you know, politics. All right. Now then the question is, well, what did God intend here, and why did God do this? You know, and, you know, it's not the way, you know, that's not the way we really look at things in Judaism generally. It's more like, you know, God wanted there to be diversity here, you know. So not fighting, but diversity, you know. And that's the answer. God made a diverse world for a purpose. All right, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment, and we'll see you later.